I just wanted to say quickly before we start that this particular event is part of our ongoing Science on Screen program, and it's part of a big initiative we do with support from the Sloan Foundation. We have a great website called Sloan Science on Film. So I urge you to visit that site. There's a lot of new content there every week. The executive editor of that site who put this program together today and does such a great job all year round for us is Sonia Epstein, who's right here. So I just wanted to thank her. I also wanted to say that the real occasion for doing this screening again, because of course we showed this film in the summer as part of our 70mm series, but this book, Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick, Arthur C. Clarke, and the Making of a Masterpiece by Michael Benson, just came out within the past year, and it really is, I think, the definitive book on the film, which is saying a lot considering how much has been written about this film. It's so beautifully researched and it reads like literature. So I really urge you to get this book. We are doing a book signing afterwards. And so far I know that in addition to Michael, Dan Richter will sign the book, and we're going to see if Keir Dullea will join us as well, but the book signing will be after the discussion that we have. So we have a discussion. We're very, very excited that Keir Dullea will be with us for the first time. We've shown this film so many times, but he will be here. And Dan Richter, who plays Moonwatcher at the beginning of the film, is with us, and in fact, he's right here. So if you feel like throwing a bone in the air at the right time, feel free. So all I want to say in terms of how we do this presentation, and our chief projectionist, Fred Baez, has become probably the world leading projectionist of 2001: A Space Odyssey. So applaud him before we start the film. So we're showing what was called the roadshow version, which just means that in the beginning there's a musical prologue that plays before the curtains open. So we will show that. There's also intermission music, and we'll play that. So that's all as intended in the original release. And the only thing we're going to cut short a little bit is that there is about 5 minutes of exit music, and we'll play a little bit of that to give you a flavor for that, but rather than exiting the theater, we're going to go into our discussion. So that's anyhow, that's all you need to know about the screening. And here we go. Enjoy the film, and we'll see you afterwards. And so I'm sure you're going to want to stick around. Heather Berlin will be the moderator for the discussion, including Michael Benson and Dan Richter and Keir Dullea.
Test.
You think I know something like that? Yes. No?
Yes.
No. Yes. Okay. I just want to say something about Michael Benson's book. And do come tomorrow if he's going to be here for an hour talking to you. It's the best thing I have ever read about this film, and I'm in it. I learned more about things that I never knew what was going on. It's a fabulous book.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Keir. Thank you.
I agree.
Thanks, guys.
First of all, I have to say it's just an honor to be on the stage with all of you, immensely talented people. This film obviously is one of the greatest seamless demonstrations of the relationship, I think, between art and science. So I really want to delve into that today while I have you all. And first, I also want to say, Keir, you've aged much better in real life than you do in the film. You look great. So I thought there's so much I want to get into. I don't even know where to begin, but I thought I'd break it up maybe into two parts, where first we can talk a bit about the behind the scenes, the making of the film and the writing of the book, and then maybe the second half get more into a conversation about AI, which is something that I'm fascinated by being a neuroscientist. So since you both have had firsthand experience working with Stanley, I'm really curious about your experiences with him. I mean, some people say he was very intimidating. You know, others say that they were struck by they were almost charmed by his candor. So, Keir, I'm wondering if you could describe your first impression of Stanley when you met him back in London in 1965.
Never intimidating. I loved every minute of working with him. The only problem I had to get over was I was in such awe by that time of Stanley Kubrick. I'd seen Dr. Strangelove, Lolita, my favorite Kubrick film, Paths of Glory with Kirk Douglas, and The Killing. I had seen all those films, and I couldn't believe that I was going to end up working with this master. So my problem was getting over the awe that I was feeling, because awe doesn't help you in your work. It kind of pulls you back. So, and he did that. I mean, he never raised his voice. I had just finished a film, one of the most horrendous directors you could ever dream to work with, which was Otto Preminger. And if you saw Stalag 17, he was the German commandant of the concentration camp, and that was Otto on a nice day. Anyway, but working with Stanley was fabulous.
Wow. And Dan, what about you? What was your first experience like meeting him and your impression?
Well, I wasn't looking for a job, and I was just a mime, a theater mime. I wasn't really in pictures at all. And Stanley and Arthur had finished with Keir and done the other live action stuff, but they still didn't have an opening. And so they asked me to come out. We had mutual friends. Asked me to come out so we could talk to a mime. And so I found this. Yeah, exactly. I found this scruffy, funny, so knowledgeable about everything under the sun. I went into this room, this little teeny office. You'd think he'd have a big office, little office piled with books and pieces of paper and pens and this wonderful guy with a Bronx accent who immediately asked me for a cigarette because Cristiano wasn't letting him smoke. And 14 months passed, and we kept talking the whole time, and I fell in love in about 10 minutes, and I stayed that way for the rest of my life.
Wow.
Wasn't he going to initially have you train everybody for this film, wasn't it?
Yeah, I didn't even think I'd play Moonwatcher because he when I came on, he said, well, we don't know what to do, whatnot, and I said I thought it was an acting problem, not a movement problem, and you just had to get the audience involved with real characters, like the Seven Dwarfs, Sleepy, Doc, whatnot. You have to know who they are. So I said, I could do that. I could put together this for you, but I don't want to act in it because it would be too complicated to act and do that and whatnot. And he said, well, we got to do it in 10 weeks. And I said, well, I think it would take more like 10 months. And he liked that, being Stanley. He said, oh, finally somebody who can, is really going to dig into this and give me something. And it was months before, and he kept always mentioning, you're going to play Moonwatcher, are you? No, I'm not going to do that. But finally, he twisted my arm enough, and I did it.
By the way, I think it's interesting that the first adjective you used to describe him is scruffy.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I've got this scene in my book where Tony Fruin, who I think was 17 or 18 at the time, had his first interview with Stanley Kubrick, and he was parked in a conference room while his dad went to find the great director, and so Tony was in there looking at art books, and it was Kubrick's Inner Sanctum, and this guy came in, bearded, scruffy guy who he assumed belonged to the Char Force, and he ignored him, and then the guy left and came back, and then he's looking at the art book, and then finally the Char guy, the janitor, said, sorry, are you Tony? Are you Tony Fruin? Fruin said, oh, yeah, who are you? Stanley Kubrick. So there were ash stains on his clothing and all this stuff from all the smoking.
But apparently, I mean, he was a bit of a perfectionist, and in your book, Michael, actually, you cite stuntman Bill Weston's description of Kubrick's funky moral turpitude concerning safety issues, right? So can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because I mean, we're giving him a lot of, you know, compliments and awe-inspiring, but was there something a bit Hallian to him in the sense of?
When we were working on the centrifuge, everyone was ordered to wear a hard hat for a while, and gradually one hat went and then another, and you know, it was very slow. Stanley always had his hard hat on throughout, always.
He shot the leopard scene in a cage. But he was in the cage, not the leopard.
By the way, one of my proudest moments, I think, in writing the book is to get to the bottom of that particular, but your interview with your great collaborator, who now, of course, now that I'm on stage, his name escapes me, but lead makeup man for
Stuart.
Yeah, Stuart Freeborn. Yep. So Freeborn, I saw, you know, Dan was kind enough to give me transcripts of conversations he had while he did his book, which is called Moonwatcher's memoir, which is a great read. And you know, when I asked, him to if he still had the transcripts, he immediately sent me all the transcripts, and I found this priceless moment, you know, where you're talking to Stuart, and Stuart's wife, whose name is. Oh. Okay. Anyway, who was working just as hard as Stuart on the shoot. The two of them were remembering. You asked about the leopard attack scene, and they were just kind of talking about it a little, and then his wife said, and then Stanley was in a cage. Yeah. And I was like, what? You know, and then you said, oh, that's right. And then Stuart said, that's right, funny that. And I was like, I got him. You know, so this scene is in the book.
And I had to be, if you see the other apes there, my guys wouldn't go on the set.
Right.
So I said, okay, I will be halfway between you and the leopard, so that if the leopard doesn't go after Terry Duggan and comes after me, comes in our way, he'll have to go get me first.
But you should tell them and tell us the story about the first take. Please,
well,
sir.
The first take, we started. You know, we had the leopard and a lion we were working with, and I was in charge of all the animals. We had them down at Southampton Zoo, so I'd periodically go down and we'd look at the animals, and I'd take pictures and bring them back to Stanley and say the tapirs are doing very well, and I don't know about the zebra, you know, that kind of stuff. And so we got it all set. And Terry Duggan, who was the stunt man who was working with the animals. We got it all set up. We put the leopard up on the thing, and now this poor leopard, you know, never can you imagine being in a sort of zoo cages all your life, and then all of a sudden you're on this set, which the temperature is about 110, you know, and there's these massive lights and people all around and whatnot. So the leopard, we figured, well, he'll just jump on Terry, which he was trained to do. He didn't. He jumped down and started going for me, and so Terry came running after him and tackled him just before he got to me. And so that was our first take. You know.
and Keir, did you have something? What some of the scenes that were shot in the emergency airlock and the wire work during that scene? Were there some danger involved there?
Yeah, this is maybe at this moment is worth mentioning or reminding everybody that there was no computer-generated special effects. It didn't exist in those days. So everything, one way or the other, had to be photographed directly. And that was kind of scary because it's shot as if I'm weightless being blown into that emergency airlock. So I kind of bounce back and forth toward and away from you as you watch the film. Actually, it was filmed upside down so that the camera was on the ground and the opening to where the pod is up against the opening of the chamber is at the ceiling, probably about this height, maybe a little higher. And they had a platform that was out of camera sight parallel with that. And there was a circus roustabout up there with me, and he had measured the drop several times, and they had a rope that was twined into a cable that was attached to my rear. And he measured the drop, then he tied a huge knot. Then he measured it again, the same length, and tied another knot. So he's next to me, and on action, I dived, because I had to they couldn't use a stuntman, because if you remember, my character's forgotten his helmet. So on action, I dove free fall toward the camera, and just inches away from the camera lens, that man up there jumped off. So, no, let me think. Yeah, he jumped off, so he went hurtling to the ground. I went hurtling back to the ceiling. But of course, the camera is subjective. It doesn't realize it's looking up. It looks like it's looking that way. So when his feet hit the ground, he let go again, waiting for the second knot. And I went hurtling back toward the camera. That's how that was done. Fortunately, in one take.
Movie magic. So
this is a man who's afraid of heights, by the way. I might add, afraid of flying, right? Am I right?
I was at the time.
Yeah, well, that's all
But,
bad,
but
right?
not only me. Stanley, Gary Lockwood, who played the other astronaut, and myself, all three of us did not fly. In fact,
Wow.
Stanley got a private pilot's license a few years before we worked together, and as soon as he got his license, he refused to fly ever again.
Near-death experience, actually, taking a plane up, and he hadn't thrown one of the switches.
I didn't realize.
Yeah, I heard that, yeah.
Well, Michael, in your book, there are a lot of accounts of Kubrick asking collaborators for their views and suggestions, right? And he had this maxim that said, never let your ego get in the way of a good idea. So I wanted to ask each of you if you could give a concrete example of Kubrick taking on board one of your creative suggestions that made it to the film.
Well, you always felt that you could, you never felt that you were transgressing on some place you shouldn't go. He always was very open to ideas. Didn't necessarily mean he'd use them. The only idea I remember coming up with that he used was when I knocked the glass off in that strange room at the end, and I just wanted to have a different physical position when I hear the next oldest version of myself, rather than just hearing something and turning my head. So I said, Stanley, just so I can have a different physical being, can I just knock the glass off and as I'm going down and reaching it up? So there was no.
It was so interesting. I was reading into the symbolism, obviously, of the body is fragile, it's breaking, it's dying, the soul moves on. But it really was just to change your physical body position in the shot.
But that's so commonly how art is made. You have, especially collaborative art, where you have these ideas, you cook them, you evaluate, and then sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But I find that extraordinary, actually, because that particular moment has been so analyzed and overanalyzed, and it's all the Jewish weddings of history. It's all, it's this, that, and the other thing, but that's great, and by the way, I would not take away from Stanley, it was your idea, but he as author said, okay. You know what I mean? And I've compared him to a jazz, like a Miles Davis figure in a sense. He came out of jazz, and he was a jazz drummer. Christian Kubrick told me he was practicing drums. He would practice on the weekends during the 2001 shoot. He was playing drums, And jazz is all about, you have the band leader, like a big ego band leader, but that you have to know how to listen, right? To your collaborators. And I think Dan also can probably, I'm sure, attest to that.
Yeah, did you have any?
I had a lot. First of all, we had a big green table covered with baize, and we'd all sit around it. So we'd be he'd want me to go to screenings to see everything else as well as what I did. He wanted everybody to speak up and give their ideas. But the main thing was, from the very beginning, when I came on, they brought out these costumes, and it looked like straitjackets, And I was in constant battle with him and Stuart over Stuart Freeborn, our wonderful genius makeup guy, because I needed it the body to be expressive, that was the battle all the time. They wanted to make these mechanical kind of hands. No, I can't do that. That's why the mask had such big eye holes in it, so we had to be able to see the eyes. The body, we have very little padding relative to the way they wanted us, because I wanted the body to be able. So I was constantly doing this, and Stanley would always listen, and if he could do it, it was a good idea. He was 100% behind it.
You know, the thing with improv, what we're learning from neuroscience is actually it's just different brain state, and you actually decrease parts of your brain that have to do with the filter system and control, and you actually let go and can access some of these more unconscious, subconscious, thoughts. So it's a really creative state of mind to be in, and you're open to listening, and you also have a loss of ego when you're in those states. And I'm sure as actors, you know what it's like to be in that state. So he was very open to improv. And but when you interviewed his now widow, Christiane, she also described his sense of shame at these last minute changes and hairpin turns that were making it into his story. So can you talk a little bit about that? Yeah,
that was one of the. So Christiane is a wonderful, witty, profane, smart, creative person. I really love her. And she opened up to me. I think she sensed that I wasn't there to exploit the Kubrick name or anything like that. And she opened up to me, and I was very privileged at that. For that happened. And she got to a point as we were discussing Stanley's character, where she said, and I asked her about how I actually mentioned that this big budget film, from all the information I was getting, was really improvisational, which is, by the way, extraordinarily unusual that you'd have a big budget Hollywood production and things were being changed at the last minute. I said, what was that like? Did he come home? What was the story? He was changing things, and I quoted Tony Masters, the production designer, who said that the art department was suicidal because they would plan things, they would spend all this money, they would build structures, sets. They would set it all up for the shoot the next morning. Maybe you can speak about this. And Stanley would come in and say, we're not doing it that way at all. We're doing it completely differently. And but Christiane gave me a peek behind the scenes of what happened the night before. And there was shame, and there was doubt, so my read on it, my take on it is that, he had to show this absolute self-confidence on the set and, at MGM, Borehamwood Wood, he was just sure of himself. But he would get home and he would feel shame that he hadn't gotten it right and that he had to change everything.
Like a vulnerability.
Yes.
Show. Yeah.
And then I said, Stanley felt shame? Is that right? And Christiane said, oh yeah. I said, but I still couldn't believe it. And I said, but I've spoken to everybody lots of people who work with him, and I've never gotten the slightest hint of that. And she said, yeah, because he hid it very well.
Did either of you ever get a sense from him of any kind of self-doubt, or was he just leading the ship completely?
I agree with Michael. From my point of view, he was always calm, and as I said, he never raised his voice and was so curious about things. I mean, somebody brought on a brand new kind of 35 millimeter camera. I don't remember the make of it, but it was he stopped shooting. He wanted to examine this camera in the middle of it was expensive. It was an expensive film to make, and he would stop for half an hour or more just to examine whatever it is. He had such an eye for detail. What an eye for detail! Now, there's an amusing thing that I'll tell you about. My wife caught this. Nobody else that I know of ever caught this in the film. And a few years ago, she said, "Hey," and then she told me what she saw. In the scene when Floyd is on the space station, and he's walking, and he's stopped by some Russian scientists who question him about his purpose of for the trip. And just before he arrives at that group, there's a public address system. It's kind of muffled. It's nothing you'd notice as a filmgoers, particularly, just one of those background noises. But there is this muffled announcement of something, and then he reaches the group and has the scene. If you ever see the next time you see this film, there are 3 women and 1 man. One of the women, or I think 2 of them, had no lines. Depending on this is what my wife caught, depending on the angle of the camera, in one shot there's a blue sweater over the back of one of the chairs. On another shot, there's no blue sweater. So Stanley, obviously, when he was editing the film, noticed this. And so he put in this public address system, which was something to the effect of a blue sweater has been found. And go to the lost and found. I mean, who else? You've noticed? Did you notice it, by the way?
Well, I noticed it because you told me when we spoke on Skype that time. Otherwise, I wouldn't have noticed that. I just thought it was airport-style chat or chit-chat, you know. Yeah.
That is fantastic. I mean, I want to get into a little bit of a discussion about the iconic Dawn of Man sequence. But before I do, just because you kind of mentioned it and it was something that really caught my attention, especially in this day and age, was the lack of diversity and of women in the film, right? I mean, there was a few women speaking roles. 3 of them were stewardesses. One was that one scene where that one woman scientist showed up and spoke, and then it was just like a mother and daughter Skype. I call them Skype calls now. Obviously, it's translated into the future. But you know, were there any? You know, I understand it was the 1960s and it was a different time, but they didn't seem to project. They did sort of project the sort of 1960s sexism into the future. They also wrongly projected Pan Am into the future, but that's another story. But were there any women and people of diversity behind the scenes, or you know, working on the film? I mean, because it just seemed like a lot of white men. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but you know, I'm just wondering.
Right. Well,
Some white men
Stuart's wife, she did an awful lot of work. There just weren't a lot of women. I couldn't because all my people had to have very thin hips.
Right.
You know, so I was.
But you did have some female man apes with breasts that function.
Well,
there's
we
a
had
story.
Okay, I'll tell it. What you saw the little chimps, you know, who played the babies. We wanted to have a breastfeeding scene. You see, so Stanley said to me one day, "I want you to." Cast women for their breasts, and I literally had to go in a room, and they would bring the woman in. She'd take her top off, and I would go in and examine her breasts, you know, and write notes about it, and we'd take pictures to show Stanley.
Wow. This is digressing in a very.
I'm sorry, but
the 1960s. That's how it was.
That's what we did.
Wow. All right. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this Dawn of Man scene. Well, first of all, I have a personal story. So with Neil, so now I co-host a show with Neil, but about 6 years ago when I first met him, I actually was invited to his apartment by Bill Nye, the science guy. And there I am, and I was nervous, you know, meeting Neil and Bill, and we had a few drinks, you know, over dinner. And we got into a conversation about how, you know, the universe is the cosmos' way to know itself. And then that led to a discussion of 2001. And Neil's like, you know, I'm getting inspired. We need to hear the music. So he goes on this big stereo system and plays the, you know, dun, 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 right? And he and Bill proceed to enact the scene. They start jumping up on the couches and to the music, and he grabs something that's the bone, and they act out this whole scene.
How many drinks did you have?
It wasn't that many, surprisingly. And so then I got involved, and I got into it as well. And it was a real bonding experience, and we became friends ever since, and he asked me to be on a show from that. So for me, that was a seminal scene personally. But you know, Keir, you've actually said that scene, and especially the moment, the realization when you can use the bone as a weapon, was your favorite scene in the entire film.
Well, I was going to tell Dan, two of my favorite moments in the film. Maybe it's because I had least expectations when I saw the film. It was the only part I'd seen the set for the space station and then my section of the film, but because that was the Dawn of Man sequence was filmed after we were all done. My 2 favorite moments, I think, in the film is the moment when you are seemingly aimlessly fussing around with the bones, and there's a moment when the penny drops. And it's the moment, I don't know if you actually do this, but the feeling that you gave. You ever watch a dog when it's terribly, unexpectedly curious about something? It'll do something like, right? I don't know whether you actually tilted your head.
I actually did.
You did. That's what I thought.
6
it's
times
an
I was counting.
extraordinary moment. It's the moment in history when the penny drops. And the other moment is when in victory, after getting the water hole back, you throw the bone into the air, and it's one of the greatest jump cuts in the history of film. It morphs into a space vehicle. And by the way, again, Stanley never over-explained things. He was going to have, like, writing eventually show up on the screen, and he eliminated that. That isn't just a space vehicle. That is a nuclear weapon that is, because in the book, he posits that Arthur C. Clarke posits that the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War have nuclear weapons in orbit around the Earth. So the first weapon morphs into a nuclear weapon. It's an extraordinary moment.
It's phenomenal. And Dan, I mean, actually, Michael had mentioned that you've been referred to as an analog predecessor to Andy Serkis, which I love that. But, you know, what kind of observational research?
Analog, Dan. You're so analog.
No. Okay. What kind of research did you do and where did you come up with the kind of this thought to, in that moment, you know, do that head tilt? Was it from observing animals, you know, discovering things in nature? And
yeah, we did. I did months and months and months of observing animals and photographing them in slow motion. Not just primates, but all kinds of animals. The whole idea is that I wanted to create a troupe or a band that were more animal than human, because we were going to become human at that moment. That's the moment, you know. So before then, we were, you know, we smelled things, and so I worked very hard at that and did endless amount of studying and traveling and reading, and we got National Geographic was able to give us a lot of extra footage from Hugo von Lauch's study of the Jane Goodall's chimps, which we used. I read all of George Schaller's notes about Dian Fossey, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was that. That moment, you know, I knew that I had to convey something. The only thing I had planned beforehand was the slight cock of the head. That's the only thing I knew that I was going to put that in, and I knew I was going to. And the thing is, you said about Stanley. You know, one of the reasons we took so many takes is we kept discovering things in a take, and we do it again to incorporate what had been discovered. It wasn't because we weren't getting it right. And so when we started, I looked down, I saw Stanley was putting a portrait lens on, and I knew, oh my God, I'm going to be gigantic, you know. So I said, I'm going to play this whole thing as slowly as possible. I'm going to hardly move at all. I'm just going to feel my way into it. I'm supposed to pick up a bone, but I've never picked up a weapon before. I don't even know how to hold it properly, you know, and et cetera, et cetera. So I just ran it as slowly as I could, because I knew Stanley would say, because he and I were actually talking to each other during the take, because we were shooting MOS without sound. So, and I had the mask on, so I say, you don't mind I'm doing it so slowly, do you? You know, he said, no, it's okay, don't keep, you know. And when I actually did pick the bone up for the first time and sort of started, my idea was I'd play with it before I did the thing, I hit a rib bone which flew up in the air. And I said, oh, I'm sorry about that, Stanley. He said, no. I love it. Hit another one, you know. So I said, okay, you know. So I hit another one. Well, that way. And so we then, in later takes, we set them up, you know, so we could do it. But that one moment then changed everything forward in the script, and so that that big beautiful cut, you know, wasn't in the script, and that was a result of that scene and the little mistake I had made, which flipped the bone, and that turned into all of that. So that's how he would take advantage of things and utilize things.
Do you think that, well, I guess it's a question for each of you, what your most important contribution to the film was for you? Do you think it was that moment? And then I'm curious what it was for you, Keir.
No, you could say individual things, sure, but I think the most important thing I brought to it is that I brought the idea from the very beginning that it was going to be an acting problem, and that we had to create a tribe that that you believed were animals.
Right, they each had personalities.
Oh,
which
yeah.
was so interesting.
Oh yeah, we had cause my training is American Mime, and it was based on using the method to extend into a large movement, and that means everybody's got to have a character, you know.
Can I just make a little intervention? Basically, you saved the beginning of the film, right? Because everything had been shot, and the thing that was holding up the production was how to realize this highly complex, this scene that couldn't look like men stuffed or women stuffed into ape suits, right? And so, I get into that in the book. So when he got to you, he had tried 6 different things already when he wanted to speak to a mime.
Oh yeah, I mean, you should have seen all the research
Right.
there was, and you have to imagine they did. You talked about the set; they had built a set for it. They spent, I don't know, 40,000 pounds. It was a lot of money in those days, and they were all set. And Tony Masters was there. They thought, okay, we're gonna show it to Stanley today. So he walks into the studio to the set, and it's big. And he looked at it and said, "No, that's no good." Turned around, walked out, and everybody's going like, "What just happened?"
Right.
So it's not the reason they shot so late was not because they had planned to shoot late. They just couldn't come up with anything.
And you brought the solution. With
Yeah,
your
and
idea.
I had nothing to lose because I wasn't looking for a job.
Right.
I didn't want to work for Hollywood, and I loved Stanley's pictures. I thought it's a chance to meet this great artist, but I wasn't looking for a job, so I wasn't pitching anything to, so I just was telling him what I thought, and I thought you got to believe these guys. They got to grab you by the ball. Pardon me.
By the breasts? All right.
By the scruff of the neck is what you meant.
Yeah.
Keir, do you have, what do you think is you've contributed so much to the film, but what really stands out to you?
Well, I think the most challenging scene from an acting point of view was when my character disconnects Hal. And it's the most dramatic and in a way, for me, and what I thought of at the time, it was a somewhat parallel scene, although the details are completely different, to Mice and Men by Steinbeck and the film with Burgess Meredith, where his buddy, who's a little slow, is going to get strung up. And he realizes that, and he wants to, in a sense, help him avoid that kind of situation. And the only way to avoid that situation is to kill him. And so he sneaks a gun behind the head of the man, and they're discussing what they always discuss, which was this farm they're going to have together. And it's just, I don't know if that is clear to you, but to me that was the emotional parallel of putting a fellow, in the case of 2001, a fellow crew member, because Hal was like another member of the crew.
This is great because first of all, and a great transition to talk about Hal. So there's a few things. So he's obviously intelligent. He acts as if he has emotions. He says he has emotions, but we can never really know, right? Even though I can't even know that you have consciousness or emotions. I assume you do because you act like you do and you say you do, but I never can know for sure because it's first-person subjective experience or first computer experience. But we never really know, but that scene that I thought was so powerful because you have to kill him to survive, but you are emotional about it. And then he starts really pulls at your heartstrings with his telling his origin story. I was basically born, in January 1992, and then the Daisy song, so powerful and emotional. So, and which is also, just as a point, interesting point, that's the first song a computer ever sang ever.
Exactly.
So 1961, IBM made the first computer to sing, and it sang that song, which I thought was
Arthur
interesting.
Clarke was touring the lab, was brought into the lab, and it was played for him, and then he told Stanley about it, and then it popped into the film. Another example of, how collaborative art works.
We didn't have the voice that you all hear as Hal. That was done in post-production after the film was completely finished. The voice for the actors, the two of us, was Derek Cracknell, who was the first assistant director. And this film, the crew was entirely British, and so. It was all like this. So that was the voice of Hal for us. Daisy, Daisy, give it. And so that took acting.
But I love it also because, throughout the film, it's almost like Hal is the more emotional, he's neurotic and you're the more like,
Well, even some of the critics said that it almost seemed as if the human beings were more machine-like
right.
than Hal. But you got to remember, when you pick up on the story of the two astronauts, these two guys have been in space for months and months and months. They've talked about their background. There's nothing new to say. It's the same routine. Whatever they do every day to make sure everything's going well is the same, And so, and also, we talked about, when I say we, Stanley and Gary Lockwood and myself had long discussions for the week or two before we began to shoot about the characters that we were going to play, and the fact that both of us would have psychological profiles such that it would take something that would cause all of us to scream running out a doorway would just raise an eyebrow, So that it sort of explains, I think, the.
I'm sorry.
No.
It's almost like, we've been hearing a lot about Neil Armstrong because this film First Man premiered the other day. And there's no doubt that the people, the Soviets and the Americans were sending up there, they had to be, not machine-like exactly, but really cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
You don't send crazy artists up there who are subject to panic attacks. You send Neil Armstrong up there who can't emote at all, so. But can I just say a quick thing about Keir and acting? One of the pleasures of research, of getting an advance to write a book on something and getting inside the wheelhouse or under the hood or whatever metaphor about something, the production that really has affected my life. I first saw it when I was 6 years old and so on. And one of the pleasures was to be able to access all this information. And one of the things I discovered was that Stanley was putting notes in the daily production reports, And for the scene, daily production reports, I think that, anyway, there are several orders of daily record of the shooting, And for the hotel room scene, when Keir was getting progressively older and stiff and, heading, remember when he stands up and everything, he put fantastic acting. Stanley Kubrick wrote this.
That was
he
his
probably
note,
wouldn't
his
even
director's
tell
note.
you that, but he just wanted to remember that take had fantastic acting. But
Well, actually, he did say something like that to me.
Oh, okay.
The first week of shooting, because what he sensed was he sensed my being in awe, and he wanted to get me over that.
Right.
So he said something as nice as that to me to make me feel
Right.
I was okay. Let's relax.
That's good.
You're
Okay.
wonderful. Whatever.
Yeah. It was interesting to see it, written
You know,
there for history.
You might
for
be
Dan,
interested.
I didn't find that, but I don't know. No, by the time it was Dan, there was no. You guys were so into it that there was no. There was no time to write little notes.
You might be interested. Well, there was so little dialogue in this section of the film, very little, and except in one case, there was a scene that was shot where I had a scene with Mission Control, and Stanley decided not to use it later on when he was editing because it was redundant from his point of view. There was another scene where Mission Control talks to us, and he didn't feel he needed it. And it was the only scene where I had to learn a long speech, and which is not a problem for me. I've done a lot of stage acting, but this particular speech was, from my point of view, technological gobbledygook, and it was like a foreign language. So I went over it and over it and over it for weeks, because normally in a film, especially with the dialogue there, you could learn it the day before and you had it. So anyway, I can still do and the speech went like this. I'll go to my grave with it. Mission Control, this is X-Ray Delta 1. At 1920 on board Fall Prediction Center in your 9000 computer showed Alpha Echo 35 unit as possible failure within 48 hours. Request check your in-ship system simulator. Also confirm your approval our plan to go EVA and replace Alpha Echo 35 unit prior to failure. Mission Control, this is X-Ray Delta 1. Transmission concluded. I couldn't resist.
Can I just say, because I just inferred that Stanley was anything less than ecstatic about my good friend Dan's work, which I'm sure he was totally ecstatic about your work. So please forgive me. It's just that I didn't find paperwork. That's all.
We can attest to it. So just touch on the AI again. I mean, Marvin Minsky was a consultant on this film, right? And he's a very well-known MIT professor and one of the founders of the field of AI. So I thought that they've got it right. A lot of, so I'm interested, as we're now in the sort of future, way in the future, we haven't quite gotten there yet. Maybe Alexa is like the precursor to HAL. I don't know, but I mean, it's this object and we talk to it and it tells us things. Eventually it will control things like the lights in our house. And so where do you think he got it right, and where do you think he got it wrong? What do you think? And did you speak with Marvin Minsky at all to get? No,
Marvin Minsky had passed away by the time I had my project, but I read interviews with him. I watched interviews with him. I got some stories from. There was a great book published by MIT Press about HAL and AI, but that was late 90s, where he tells some stories. So I didn't have the privilege of talking to Marvin Minsky, but there's no doubt that they went, by they I mean Stanley and Arthur Clarke. They went to the top people and really picked their brains, and they found ways to pay for that, or they found ways, if it was IBM, there was product placement, but they knew to go to the right people, and they really paid attention. It was not whatever is going to seduce the audience for a period of time that this is believable is good enough for us. It was really like, what is it going to look like and why? And with that Kubrickian intelligence, this kind of omnivorous curiosity about things, he really, I mean, I'm sure he sat there with Marvin Minsky, and he just got as maximum download from that brain. That's kind of how he was. And Arthur Clarke was, a different personality, but also really interested and curious and, absorbing information and passing it on and figuring out how to turn it into art. They were both about turning it into art. That's why it was such a great collaboration, As for what they got right and wrong, it's true, we don't have a artificial general intelligence. We're sort of stumbling towards there, but I think that they got the dystopian possibilities right, So, I mean, I was I was flattered to see that there was a handout at the door here, and it was a piece I wrote for the New York Times talking about AI and the anniversary of 2001. And I said that, Keir Dullea succeeded in vanquishing HAL, or David Bowman, I think I used your alter ego's name. And we should be so lucky, given what may be coming,
Lucky, or are you aware of a new issue of Atlantic Magazine that's just come out with an article about AI and the possible negative things that we might be facing?
Well, I'm not aware of that particular article, but there have been quite a few.
And what are they give an example of there was a program, a computer was programmed to play chess, and obviously they injected the history of chess into this program so that every master that had ever come up with an idea for a move was in the program, and that program it beat the, at the time, chess champion from Russia. Right. And well, another program came up. Well, they didn't do that. They didn't use any of the background of the history of the great chess masters. They just programmed it to experiment with all the rules of the game, with nothing else. And guess what? There were something like 100 games between those two programs. The program that had no input from the history of chess tied 76 of those games and won 26 of those games. It did not lose any of the games, and get this, guess how long it took for them to program? 4 hours.
This is the thing. I mean, as we're moving forward, and I mean, AI is getting smarter and can beat us at many things. It's already way more intelligent in many things. So what is left for humans? And I think there was sort of a nod to this in the film, and maybe only it was my interpretation. I don't know if it was purposeful or not, but right in that scene where Frank gets beaten by Hal playing chess, it immediately cuts to you or Dave sketching, making art, being creative.
Oh, interesting.
And for me, that really struck a chord, because when I talk about AI and where we're going with it in terms of we're integrating technology directly into the brain now, with neural implants and things, and what's left to be human? Well, maybe it's that creativity that makes us still, these meaty objects, these cavemen who have evolved, that will be our place, perhaps, because they already can learn quicker and do things quicker, but the creativity, and they do what they're programmed to do. And so we also have to be careful, I think, going to the future. There's this philosopher, Nick Bostrom's paperclip thought experiment, where it's a paperclip maximizer, where basically he says, okay, you can program it to do something benign, like maximize the efficiency of making paperclips. But if you don't put into that program, let's say, a value for human life or something along that lines, it'll just turn everything into paperclip. The whole universe will become paperclips, and it will inevitably kill humans along the way. It's kind of what Hal is doing. Like, look, we had this mission. You humans are, not best to maximize the mission, so we need to get rid of you. And so I think what people are looking at now is to instantiate values into these programs. We just have to be careful how we program them. Did you have something?
Like Asimov's rules of robotics.
Yeah, exactly.
The first rule is you don't kill humans.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or through inattention, allow them to be hurt. Yes.
I'm going to do one more question and then open it up for questions from the audience. But so the scene at the end, right? This sort of, it's an enigma, I think. Everybody has their own interpretation of it. And, mine was that you have, of course, the glass, the physical body breaks down, but the spirit goes on. It's evolved into it. It's our next stage of evolution, perhaps. But I'm just curious as to each of your interpretations of that. What do you think, what is the ending?
Yeah. I'd love to address the whole idea of the meaning of this film. And it's one of the most common questions that I'm asked through the years about what is the ultimate meaning of this film? And at some point I read, this is relatively recently, that Stanley said the following in response: how do you explain in words Beethoven's Fifth Symphony? You can't. He said 2001 is a visual symphony, and the perfect proof of that is the Blue Danube. If you've never seen this film, what are you going to think of when you hear the Blue Danube? A river? A Vienna? Or, if you have seen the film, perhaps you think of space. Which one of those two reactions is correct? They're both correct. One of the premieres, there was a nun who said she found this film one of the most religious experiences she's ever had. Well, atheists also think that this is
the Vatican
an extraordinary
endorsed
film.
it, by the way. The Vatican had problems with Lolita.
Yeah, so
it was not okay.
It's sort of like
2001 was okay with the baby at the end.
what is the Mona Lisa smile? We
Right.
don't have
Right.
the painter to ask.
Right.
And there is no ultimate. This film is filled with metaphor of all kinds.
I also think, I was just going to say one thing is that
Yeah.
I think it's a journey into people's own subconscious, or,
Definitely.
you find in it what you find in yourself. We all interpret it in our own way,
Yeah.
depending on how we view the world. And he left it open to that. I mean, there's like 40 minutes of dialogue in a 142-minute film. So it's just this canvas that he, of course he's giving you ideas and things, but I think you create it with your own unconscious, what you make of it. Everybody's interpretation is different. Did you have any?
I was going to say, and most of that dialogue is banal. Yeah.
Right.
It's not important. It carries the story forward and whatnot, but it's not important.
Not the crux of the film. The dialogue is not the main. Yeah.
One of the sources of tension between Arthur Clarke and Stanley Kubrick throughout the production was, Arthur worked with words, of course. He was a writer. And he explained a lot. He wanted to explain a lot. And the script, bore the script was really not a script the way we understand it today. It was more like a treatment, But so and Kubrick there was supposed to be a voiceover narration, and on quite a few Stanley Kubrick films, you have voiceover. I mean, the previous and the next, right? But Stanley had I really admire many things about him, but one is that he had the courage to always go for the ambiguity, as you suggested there, and when you mentioned the Mona Lisa, I mean, there was a Playboy interview. Those used to be a big deal when Playboy interviewed somebody. There was a Playboy interview at the end of '68, late '68 of Stanley Kubrick, and they asked that question: "What did it mean? Can you tell us what is your interpretation?" And he said, one of the things he said is, "What would we think about Mona Lisa if Leonardo had written on the back, 'The lady is smiling because she's hiding a secret from her lover'?" And he said, "I don't want that to happen to 2001." So he had the vision and the courage to drop. He had Arthur, by the way, writing voiceover text up until December '67, and it premiered in April '68. And then finally he sent a telegram to him, because that's what people sent in those days, saying, "No more work on the voiceover necessary. I decided it's not going to be in." And Arthur was quite upset. And then part of the drama of the release of the film is people didn't get it, right? Especially people over 30.
For sure.
But you couldn't trust anyway.
The film did not get predominantly good reviews. 60 or more % of the reviews were from bad to terrible, and there were some wonderful reviews, but they were in minority. Mm-hmm. And the second premiere was in New York City, Washington, D.C., then New York, and then Los Angeles. At the New York premiere, 250 people walked out. And then, within a couple of months, suddenly there were lines around the block. And predominantly made up of young people. It was the young generation. It was the generation who was protesting the Vietnam War. It was that age group that made this, so much so that the officials at MGM sort of said, well, maybe that's because they're smoking funny cigarettes. So they came out as a response with a new poster that said 2001: A Space Odyssey, the ultimate trip.
Right.
I mean, I was going to say, actually, it is a very trippy film. I mean, but Kubrick himself, I read that he said he's never done drugs. I don't know if that's true. And
it's true.
I loved his explanation. Yeah, he said that he, had friends who would try to enhance themselves with drugs, and that they couldn't distinguish between what was truly beautiful in the real world, in reality, and from what they were creating in their mind. And quick, and then
we were having dinner with Stanley and Christiana one evening with Roman Polanski, and Roman.
Oh, you just roll that off? Just one night dinner with.
Because Roman had just done The Incredible Vampire Killers and whatnot, and was showing it to Stanley, and Stanley saw the screening and said, "They're going to tear it apart in Hollywood, but so don't let it upset you when you get there." And Christiana had the sugar on the table that was different colored crystals. So Roman and I got talking about dope, and we were telling Stanley he should try LSD. And Stanley's response was really interesting, because he said, "I will never use drugs because I don't know where my genius comes from. And if I got high, I might lose it, and then I'd never know how to get it back."
Wow.
Did he use the word genius? I'm just curious.
Well, I probably didn't say genius, but he said he probably said, "I don't know how I do what I do."
Right,
and he acknowledged that it was a mystery to him, and he had a great respect for it. You talked about the anguish he would have at night with Christiana and whatnot. He was a searcher. He was like the sojourner who went out feeling his way in the dark. He discovered something, and he trusted that in himself, that he had that, but he didn't know where it came from, and he
wasn't
wasn't
mess with it. Yeah,
he wasn't going to mess with it.
He said that. He said perhaps if drugs, if it makes everything beautiful, then nothing is beautiful. And how do you distinguish what's special? And maybe, I think that drugs can maybe be a shortcut for people to try to become creative. But if you are naturally gifted that way, why mess up a good thing? So I think, do we have time for a couple of questions from the audience? Okay. Hold on. Let me hear right up here in front. Yeah.
I was curious about your work with Mr. Kubrick. He seemed to be somebody who was fascinated, you said, with technology, or at least the camera stuff. to be a little bit of a Luddite and distrustful of man, human people rely too much on technology, whether it's the doomsday machine or the Ludovico technique or hell. What is do you have any personal theory of what triggered Hal's nervous breakdown?
What triggered Hal's breakdown, did you say?
Well, he was asked to lie.
Yeah.
That's in the story, is that Hal is asked to lie to Poole and Bowman, and he can't tell. He's the only one who knows that there's extraterrestrials, that they've found extraterrestrials, and they're going there.
It's in the novel.
And so Hal is given a conflict that he can't deal with. He has to lie, and he does everything perfectly. How can he be perfect if he's lying?
I also think there's a hint that something's wrong with Hal, but he never underlined it in the film. But apparently the chess game with the Gary Lockwood or Frank Poole is playing, there's a mistake in it that I'm not a
Right. So that's really interesting because, of course, Stanley is famously made a living. He was a chess hustler.
He was a chess hustler at Washington Square. Yeah,
early
that's
50s.
how he saw so many movies.
Yeah, and also chess was, apart from jazz, maybe they're very antithetical. Come to think of it, but I think I'm not the person who originated this idea, but there's something about how incredibly complex and it's let me just say, making a film is really a bit like chess. You have to, think 10 moves ahead, right? You have to really, and he had the discipline. He taught himself the discipline. To play chess really quite well, and it transposed to film. But that scene where your fellow astronaut was playing, it's interesting because only chess. He was like a little love letter to his friends at Washington Square Park, because you would only catch that Hal says, okay, queen to bishop something, but on the screen that piece is one frame on, one move off. It's not right, So he's not accurate. Hal was not accurately stating what was on the screen, but the human astronaut, fallible human astronaut, said, "Yeah, I guess."
You make that night move, and you don't have a check situation.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right, and so he conceded. The human astronaut conceded and said, "Okay, I withdraw. I would resign." And then you have the drawing scene right next. It was also, I think, a little bit of a little love letter to Bergman, where you had the knight playing chess with death, right, in the Seventh Seal. And that astronaut, your fellow astronaut was the one who was killed, and you survived. Maybe because you didn't play chess with the Hal. I don't know.
Or he was fooled by the computer. There was the other thing where he repeats a line, Hal, and he makes a mistake, right? Is that right? When I think the scene is when you're talking about how humans are fallible. I can't make any mistakes, whatever. But then there's something that the computer repeats. He says it twice, and I found that to be a mistake as well. Because why say it twice? I can't remember exactly what it was. But I don't know. Being a technophobe, Kubrick, one of the inspirations was the film is he went to the, the 1964 fair right here in Queens, and he saw the film To the Moon and Beyond, and was so taken by that, and then contacted the producers and started a dialogue with them, and I think hired them for the film, and so he was looking for things, and he was, I don't know if he was afraid of the technology, or maybe this was his ode to we should be afraid of the technology,
Well, it's all dialectical, right?
Yeah.
It gives and takes.
I'll do someone back there. Yeah. You? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit more about the evolution of Hal as a character? Did his lines change in response to the line readings of the actor, and how did the visuals and the voice come together? Was that something that was set in early, or did that evolve as the film came together?
I didn't quite. I'm a little hard of hearing, so.
It was a very complex process, and Hal started out kind of as a dim bulb called Athena. Actually, it's interesting.
Wait, why did they change from a woman named? Yeah, I remember they changed from Athena to Hal.
Yeah.
What's that about?
So there was a female computer that wasn't particularly intelligent, and then became.
And as she became more intelligent, they changed it to a man's.
Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? I never even thought of that, but yes. There were a lot more. lines recorded, you had a lot more dialogue, didn't you, as you were deprogramming Hal than what was in the final cut? Am I right? The question concerned, did Hal's line readings change depending on what you said in the studio, if I remember correctly? How to what extent was that modified later?
I can't remember that well what the detail. I don't remember the lines that weren't used, to tell you the truth.
Right. But it was interesting to read the transcripts of how much dialogue had been cut between you and Hal. There was a lot more of it, which just Stanley had no mercy. And, kill your darlings, right?
Right. Yeah. I love the part, just at the end when he's fighting for self-preservation. I found that so profound. And he kept repeating over and over, I can feel, I'm losing my thoughts.
My mind is going.
Yeah. I mean, that was just so...
I saw that film the first time, age 6, as I mentioned earlier. And when I came away from it, there were two of my strongest memories were the power of that scene, which is utterly mesmerizing to me. Utterly, first of all, somehow, you guys managed to create an utterly convincing sense of deep isolation in deepest space with just one human being and one computer dueling it out. And it was so convincing and spooky. The other one was, of course, Dan's, realization about the bone, and I was 6 years old. I didn't really get it, but that's part of the beauty of this film. It's a visual symphony. You don't have to understand everything necessarily to get it here, right?
I would love to just mention at this point, give a little credit to the actor that did the voice of Hal.
Yes,
and
he's still alive in Toronto.
He's still living. Yes,
What's his name?
He's in Stratford, Ontario.
Oh. Douglas Rain.
Douglas Rains is in Canada. He's unknown in this country, but in Canada was known as the Laurence Olivier of Canada. He did all the major Shakespearean roles at Stratford for many, many, many years. And I mean, and yet he only worked 2 days, I believe.
Yes, on this film.
On this film, he did that all in 2 days.
He's most known for this film, where even his voice was slowed down a little, which I get
he's
into.
brilliant.
He is brilliant, absolutely.
I just can't imagine calling up his house and he picks up and you're like, hello. Be a little freaky.
I can feel it.
Let me take something from the back so I can... Are there any women? Women, come on.
Yeah,
I'm only
speak
taking a
up so
woman
we
question
can-
right there. Yeah.
Speak up so we can hear you.
Yes,
right there.
Okay, so first, before I make my question, I'd like to share my experience with the movie. First time I watched it, I was suffering with severe depression, and after I watched it for the first time, my whole sense of curiosity, of being interested in mystery of life and the other, was revived completely. So it was a very powerful experience to me, and I'm very thankful for that. So I would like to know, what was the experience of watching the product of your work for the first time? How did you feel after you sat down and watched the result of that long process for the first time?
How did you...
What's it like to
What was it like to watch
it?
your work?
Oh, well, the whole film, as I said, I started with the Dawn of Man sequence. It blew me away. I mean, I didn't, we worked such long hours that although I think we were invited to rushes, I think I only went one day. I was so tired by the end of the day. It took me so long to get into makeup and out of makeup. That hair is not my own hair. That was a wig that they had to put on. That took just putting that on took a half an hour. So I never went and saw any of the effects visually at all. So when I went to the world premiere of this film, it was like all new, and it blew me away.
For me, it was totally different because after we finished shooting, Stanley asked me to stay on, and I worked with Doug Trumbull and Con Pedersen on the Stargate sequence, and Stanley and I were trying to create an alien right up to the last day, and I did, I'd paint me all kinds of colors and things and whatnot. But so I saw a lot of the cut. I would see what he and Ray were cutting. So I saw a lot of it. So when I saw it the first time, all I sat there is I saw the opening. I thought, oh my God, I screwed up. Oh, I could see the seam in the costume. And I came out of it like, oh God, like that. It took about 30 years before I could see it as it is.
I don't know if this is true, but I've been told that, Planet of the Apes won the, I think it came out the same year, didn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. And best makeup.
Yes.
Now, why didn't Stewart get it? I mean,
Okay. That's an interesting story.
you tell it.
Okay, so Stewart, they wanted to hire Stewart for Planet of the Apes, and Stanley had kept Stewart late, because that film went on and on and on. That production was years over, over its release date, and so they hired another very skilled makeup artist whose name I forget at the moment, and John Chambers. Thank you. At that time, there was no Best Makeup Oscar, but they gave him, a special award for makeup that year for Planet of the Apes and the monkey suits, where they are really palpably human beings stuffed into monkey suits. And then Arthur Clarke was going around fuming and saying to everybody who would listen that he thought that the committee that voted on that thought that the apes in 2001 must be real. They were so good. And I think there may very well be something to that, because I also have this great little story, about Stewart seeing the film for the first time 2 years later. He was so busy, and he went to see it in Times Square in New York City. He was working on another film, and he was sitting, I tell the story in my book, he was sitting a couple rows, a row in front of this couple with their kids. And the woman says to the man, how do they get them to act like that? Are they real? Are they real? And the man says, yeah, of course they're real. They're trained. They're trained. And Freeborn came away going, that was my reward. I didn't need an Oscar after that, because he knew that he wasn't going to get an Oscar because Stanley was so security conscious. But he said that is what it took. That's all I needed, is to know that conversation happened and people were thinking that. And of course, that's a tribute to Stewart and Dan.
It's so much, they're even so much more real than like some of the CGI stuff we see now. I was thinking in my mind, like, what if this movie was made today, with all the CGI, whatever? I don't think it would be as great.
Right.
I think,
I agree.
There's something to that authenticity that you just can't get now with the films. The one thing that bothered me, though, and I think we have time for one more question, right? But the hair, like, why didn't the hair float around? Or was it always because it was anti-gravity? I was just trying to figure that out. The hair never moved.
There's a lot of stuff like that. They're not at the same weightlessness you'd have on the moon, for instance. They're walking around instead of sort of floating step around. And there's you don't see the jets of the ships landing on the moon. There's a lot of stuff like that.
Gel. It was gel.
Oh, it was the gel
Gel.
that kept it down. That's a good explanation. That's the one I like. Okay, we have time for one more question. All right, I'll take this guy here in the front. Here.
We were speaking a lot about music, and I love the choice of music throughout the film. But I'm a musician myself and a composer, and I know that Alex North wrote the entire soundtrack for the movie. And I wonder if you could elaborate more if you actually were in contact with Alex North, or why Kubrick decided not to take the music in the last moment.
I know the answer to that. Alex North wrote beautiful music. It was recorded and whatnot, and I have the CD of it. But the problem was Stanley was going way over budget, and the guys from MGM were coming out. The suits were coming out from Hollywood to look at it, and so he had the guys pull the most exciting stuff out, and he needed some music. So he sent Tony Fruin into town. He gave him 50 quid and said, "Go in and just buy me some records." And Tony came back with all this classical music, and it had Zarathustra and all of that kind of stuff. And so they cut it together just literally overnight to put behind all this stuff. And the guys came in, and everybody was blown away by it. And that's when Stanley got the idea. Wow, and But that's a perfect example of how he took advantage of things that just happened.
Improvisation, right? Did you want to say something?
Well, I was going to mention in the journey through time and space, before I reached that strange room, you see quick shots of my face reacting to what's going on. It almost looks like stills, but they were actually filmed. And Stanley used, you had the same experience. There was no sound when I just had a huge camera about this far away from my face. And what Stanley did was he played music like they used to do in the silent movie days to put me in the mood. And what he played was a very mysterioso piece of music, which was Vaughan Williams Antarctica Suite. And it was this one movement that was very mysterious, and it was very helpful.
I love that. Wow. Well, I mean, this has been fantastic, fascinating, insightful. Thank you all so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks.